The Resident Evil franchise has continued to endure over the past 20 years, and the secret to this success is innovation, examining its strengths and weaknesses and making drastic changes to the core of the formula to resonate with audiences new and old. In the first episode of Revisiting Evil, we explored the earlier games in the series, the phase of survival horror. This was Resident Evil as it was first conceived, a fundamental disconnect between the player and their character, a large convoluted space full of locked doors and puzzles, enemies that challenge your mastery of mechanics, and a resource management challenge that forces you to remember key locations, the paths between them, and how threatening those spaces are prone to be. But after 5 core games, plus a re-release and a director's cut, the series went in a new direction, one that was arguably well received, if not well remembered, and has had a lasting influence not just on Resident Evil, but the entire video games industry. I'm Tommy Thompson, and in this episode of Design Dive, we will be taking a look at 2005's Resident Evil 4 and its immediate successors, Resident Evil 5 and 6. We'll look at the drastic changes to player mechanics and encounter design, how this impacts enemy AI overall, and how the series evolves from survival horror to a more terror-focused experience, while still retaining much of Resident Evil's appeal.
Resident Evil.
As discussed back in the first chapter of Revisiting Evil, the original survival horror games in the series thrive on the disconnect between the player and their avatar. Jill, Leon, and all the other playable characters are shown to you from fixed camera angles, with the egocentric controls having the player move relative to their heading. These tank controls are focused on having the player rotate on the spot and move forwards or backwards. The displacement of the character's forward heading when compared to the direction of the camera meant that players would feel out of sync with the experience and would lead to small but potentially deadly mistakes as you panic in the heat of the moment. This character control scheme is one of the 3 core design elements of the early Resident Evil games. It sits alongside 2 additional aspects: the non-linear exploration of the environment, with a need for the player to build an intimate understanding of the world and its interconnectivity, and the final aspect being the need for resource management to help the player know when to fight or flee. We looked at how all these pillars establish the tone of the original games, and how the enemy AI design is built to reinforce it. It's a system that works towards forcing the player to address these elements of control, of world knowledge, and resources. But of course, from Resident Evil 4 onwards, the games changed drastically. So how do these pillars evolve? How does the AI work in the context of newly refined mechanics? What Resident Evil 4 brings mechanically is equally drastic as it is subtle, and all of it fits around a core game design principle known as the 3 C's: the character, the camera, and the controller. The most noticeable change is in the camera, while the other 2 have quite significant revamps. As is evident, the big shift is in the placement of the camera, which is now moved to an over-the-shoulder perspective a few feet behind the player avatar. This allows the player to see with much more clarity what is happening in front of them. Naturally, this is a huge change, not just for the player, but the makeup of the game itself. The earlier Resident Evil games, with exception of the Dreamcast's Code Veronica, used pre-rendered backdrops to render the game world. Resident Evil 4 is a huge deviation, given the world is, like Code Veronica before it, fully rendered 3D environments. This adds a lot more nuance to the world, not to mention how the player can act within it, and, as we'll discuss shortly, opens up the agency of the enemy AI characters. But this shift in perspective strips some of the mechanics of the game of their potency. As discussed, it's that disconnect between perspective and orientation that made early Resident Evil games a challenge for many to overcome, and without it, the game feels very different. And the camera being swapped to behind the character hides the underlying truth. If you compare the movement mechanics of Resident Evil 1 and 4, they're nearly identical. The controls, for the most part, don't change. You can walk or run forward, walk backwards, turn left, turn right, and U-turn. As we discussed in the first video, it's the position of the camera that obstructs your ability to master these controls, but that change of perspective makes that same set of movement mechanics feel more potent, more applicable, and easier to manage. And it's with this in mind, if you look a little closer at the movement and combat mechanics of Resident Evil 4 and how the player controls them, we see distinct design choices that maintain the lineage of the earlier games, but with a greater emphasis on reflexes and precision. For every change that makes the experience easier for the player, there's a concession made somewhere that prevents it from being as straightforward as you might think. Consider combat. The mechanics of attacking enemies and managing equipment is consistent with the earlier games. You equip your weapon from the inventory, but in order to use it, you must put it in the ready position from which you can then attack or reload if necessary, during which the camera is zoomed in to sit next to the player's shoulder. The original games made this process more complicated, courtesy of the physical displacement, given you had to turn to face the opponent, and sometimes it wasn't 100% clear if your shot was going to line up. But even now, with the camera making clear your current heading, you still have to put a lot of effort into ensuring your shots will line up. The accuracy required for a successful hit is now much tighter, and while your control over the aim is more nuanced, it still has problems. The perspective and orientation can make it difficult to line up a shot either at distance or up close. The red laser sight helps mitigate issues within mid-range combat, but your aim is prone to drifting. Leon's arm is not stable, and drifts more the longer your aim is held. Plus, the issue of the weapon recoil can also impact your aim. So while the camera orientation implies combat will be much easier, you're still prone to mistakes. But of course, in order to get off the shot, you have to make sure you're in the right spot. Much like the original games, in readying the weapon you are rooted to the spot. But this comes with its own caveats. In the original games, you could be confident that standing in a given position would minimize the possibility of getting hurt or caught off guard, given that the fixed camera position, while not perfect, gives you a much stronger understanding of where enemies are relative to you. But now, suddenly, that blessed new third-person camera is no longer all that beneficial. The field of view is actually quite limited. This is despite the game being widescreen, with even the original GameCube released letterbox to fit a 16:9 aspect ratio, although you can change that in the options. A lot of that viewport was also blocked by the piece of man-meat that is Leon Kennedy, especially when the weapon is readied up. While the camera better aligns with the player mechanics and allows you to see objects at distance, you actually see a lot less of what is transpiring immediately around you. This is a rather deliberative move, in that it can make the game feel more claustrophobic in the heat of the moment. While you might be able to see the enemies 50 feet in front of you, you can't see those that are a mere 5 feet behind you. While all of these changes to the player camera and controls create an experience that is familiar yet distinct, the sugar on top is the changes to the player character. It's important to acknowledge the changes to the character now, given they heavily influence the design of AI characters in kind. The real change between Resident Evil 4 and those that precede it is the level of agency and interactivity afforded to the player. Leon is capable of interacting with the world in a variety of ways, be it jumping over fences and out of windows, knocking over ladders, kicking in doors, or roundhouse attacks or suplexes on enemies. The 3D environments enable both for greater interaction with the world, but it also introduces a lot of verticality, allowing for the player to climb up to higher vantage points and jump down from them when necessary. While this was, in many respects, technically feasible in the earlier Resident Evil games, the shift in environment design, combined with camera and controls, makes these mechanics all the more potent. Players can glue these together in useful ways to navigate the world, evade enemies, set up blockades, or catch them by surprise. But, as we'll see shortly, what really helps sell the Resident Evil 4 experience is that for the very first time, the enemy AI shares many of the same mechanics as the player does. While the changes to the camera, controls and character are highly evident within seconds of picking up the controller, it only takes a few minutes more before the enemy AI really sells this innovation. Unlike previous entries in the series, which had adopted zombies as the primary enemy archetype, Resident Evil 4's narrative is reliant on the Ganados, the cult followers of the Los Illuminados, who are human and, for the most part, very much alive. Infected with a variant of the Las Plagas parasite, the locals of this rural region of Spain suffer from reduced mental faculties, acting more as mindless drones, while having less acute reactions to pain and increased strength. By moving away from the zombie template, the enemy is faster, more aggressive, and capable of much more intelligent behaviour. And with the opening sequence in the village, the players come to learn how drastically this has evolved. Gone are the slow-moving and simple-minded opponents of previous games. The villagers are fast on their feet and follow the player regardless of territory, so many of the old tactics no longer hold ground. Enemies will follow you up ladders and crawl through smashed windows to hunt you down. They dodge your attacks from range, throw weapons at you, crowd you from all angles, and call on reinforcements. Suddenly, the newfound freedom of the revamped mechanics feels a lot less effective. Characters much more seamlessly move around the environment and navigate obstacles to a point that the tried and true tactics of previous games no longer hold ground. They'll knock down doors and even right ladders that have been knocked over. In practice, it means that while the gameplay of previous games doesn't hold ground, the threat and tactics required is very much the same. You need to build an awareness of surroundings, ensure you can safely ready the weapon, and open fire. You need to exploit your newfound movement to find a good line of attack, to line up your shots carefully, know when to fire, when to fall back, and how best to use each weapon at your disposal. Suddenly what is old is new once again. This time the threat of failure is a mixture of the familiar, but with new challenges presented by the change in mechanics. Am I sure there's nothing behind me? Can I line up this shot given the distance between me and my target? Do I have enough ammo to face down the enemies in front of me? But now there are new problems created by the new gunplay mechanics and the enemy AI's increasing agency. Am I going to waste a shot on an enemy that will dodge it? Can I line up the shot correctly? Do I even have time if they're going to throw a projectile? But there are some upsides to this new status quo. Like previous games, many enemies have weak points that can be exploited, and it becomes easier to do this as you aim for the head and the legs. Plus, enemies are designed to be staggered, allowing you to deal more damage with a roundhouse kick or similar attack to not only push them back, but quite often knock back other enemies as well. In addition, you can exploit the environment more to your effect, shooting enemies as they jump across gaps or knock them off ladders, and let gravity do the rest. In summary, the innovations in mechanics, combined with the enemies that face you down, are built to ensure that the player still feels like they're playing Resident Evil. The same challenges are presented, albeit with a nice new coat of paint, and it's what helps the game feel so familiar, despite being such a drastic change in perspective, in control, and in graphical fidelity. The remaining design pillars, the non-linear exploration of the environment and resource management, help reinforce the familiarity of Resident Evil 4. Each of these evolve in their own ways, but what becomes apparent, especially as the series continues, is that the franchise decides these pillars are less important, as its reliance on combat continues to be established. Non-linear exploration of game environments is a concept heavily explored in the likes of the Spencer Mansion of the original game, the police precinct in Resident Evil 2, and the island of Code Veronica. However, even as the survival horror era came to a close, this notion was proving less pervasive. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis and Resident Evil 0, two of the latter releases of that period, do not focus on a small number of large non-linear environments, but rather a larger chain of smaller areas. Resident Evil 4 continues this notion, but is arguably the last to truly embrace it. Resident Evil 4 is a lot more linear than many of the preceding games, but this time around locations are typically built into cycles. Players are introduced to a door or puzzle that the player cannot pass, and from there they must navigate through a series of areas to find the items required to proceed, with the path taken ultimately leading them back to the impasse they first discovered. This is evident from the very beginning of the game, with the entrance in the village locked off, forcing the players to move through the village to find the key required. It's notable that in this instance the map itself isn't actually cyclical, but rather being kidnapped and meeting Luis is the mechanism to move the player to another location that feeds back to the main village area. But then slightly more traditional cyclic paths can be found in the likes of the castle later on in the game. In this instance, the sense of interconnectivity remains, but the need to remember it is much less important, given the player can seldom get lost, with objectives clearly signposted in the map portion of the menu to boot. If anything, the notion of interconnectivity has pivoted entirely from the macro to the micro. The larger map is no longer relevant, but developing a better understanding of the topology of individual areas is vital. Combat is often about finding good locations to stand your ground, and unlike earlier Resident Evils, the idea of fighting 5, maybe 10 or even 20 enemies in one encounter is quite common. Hence it's critical to understand how you can maneuver in the space as you fight. This is arguably the real second pillar that emerges in this new trilogy of games, as the emphasis becomes less on understanding the whole world, but really how you can maximise every opportunity in the room that you're in. The one design pillar largely unscathed is that of resource management. Rather, it has simply evolved into something a little different. Resource management in Resident Evil has always been about health and ammunition, but also the tools you need to solve puzzles. Not only ensuring you can survive to the next fight, but moving through the game and achieving the story progression. However, given the increased action focus, the resource management shifts entirely to combat items, with treasures and quest items locked off in another corner of your inventory, and saving the game is no longer constrained by ribbons. The game transforms Leon into a violence caddy, dragging around enough weapons, ammunition and health items to make even Arnold Schwarzenegger blush. It transforms the challenge of resource management into the opposite of earlier Resident Evil games. While previously we had to remember where items were lying around to put to use later, instead the focus now is actually an optimization problem. You're carrying everything in your granny in a magical suitcase, because, video games. Now you have to ensure you always have a good balance of available ammo to fire the myriad of guns you unlock and upgrade throughout your playthrough, swapping weapons as you go, and keeping that bazooka you've been dragging around for 3 hours for a boss fight you're having trouble completing. What cements all of this under the hood is the variety of difficulty settings on offer in Resident Evil 4, and even the hidden ones that are not so obvious. There are 3 main difficulty tiers of Resident Evil: Easy, Normal and Professional, the latter of which unlocked after completing the game on Normal. For some viewers, that might make you scratch your head, given Easy or Amateur wasn't an option in original releases on GameCube and PS2 in Western markets. It did, however, appear in PAL versions, and has since become more pervasive after the variety of ports and re-releases the game has had since 2005. The difficulty settings have a variety of changes that are built to support the 3 pillars. Combat is influenced by each difficulty by modifying the overall health and damage dealt, but more critically, the time between attacks, how long Ganados stand around exposed, and how aggressively they hunt you ranges from relatively benign to the extremes of Professional mode, where fighting off a horde is almost suicide. The map changes in some encounters. In an effort to make it easier for players, some specific puzzles are removed in Easy mode. A good example of this is the maze in Chapter 3 being completely removed from play, allowing players to move into the next sequence straight away. Lastly, items and resources are influenced by difficulty. Easy players start the game with the shotgun and shells on start, while Professional removes the options to purchase the tactical vest. Plus, as difficulty increases, the frequency and amount of dropped ammo is reduced. The difficulties are really focused on keeping players in a comfortable flow state, allowing your skill to increase with each new encounter and having enough resources to survive it. While Easy mode does remove some of the puzzle sequences in Chapters 3 and 4, each of them has a rather nasty combat encounter paired with it, be it the dogs in the maze, or even the ceiling traps, given the player has to balance between solving the puzzle and fighting the parasites on the ground. Ultimately, the game is trying to ramp up the challenge, and the enemy characters are the source behind it all. Manipulating the speed and downtime of enemy characters is a really simple and powerful mechanism to help players get a better grasp of their anxiety. A slower moving enemy that attacks less frequently is a lot less panic-inducing than the opposite. But of course, these broader shifts aren't always going to be sufficient, given the challenge of the game still comes down to each individual encounter. New encounters can shake a player's sense of progression and understanding. It could be the topology of the local area, the introduction of a new enemy such as the Chainsaw Ganado, or the cultists with shields or armoured helmets, or an encounter with one of the more unique AI enemies such as the Novistador or Garrador, not to mention boss battles like El Gigante or Verdugos. This is where the adaptive difficulty system kicks in, a largely hidden feature of the game in which enemy spawns and their overall aggression levels and damage are influenced on a per encounter basis. This is a super useful mechanism to allow the game to tailor its reactions to players based upon their recent performance. By tracking completion times of specific sequences, as well as the amount of damage dealt and received, the game customizes each encounter to react to you. So if you're breezing through the game, then enemies will become more aggressive, and each new sequence will have more of the total number that can spawn. But if you're struggling, taking a lot of damage, or even dying a lot, then the game will tone this down and even remove some of the obstacles you face, lest you're playing on Professional mode of course, in which the dynamic difficulty adjustment is disabled. If you want to find out more on this, here's an obligatory reference to the Game Maker's Toolkit episode on the subject, linked to in the description. Fast forward to 2009 with the release of Resident Evil 5, which switches the action from the rural villages of Spain to the fictional Kujuju region of Africa. The world of video games was drastically different by the time that Resident Evil 5 came to market. The impact RE4 had upon the industry cannot be understated. The third-person over-the-shoulder perspective had become something of a standard. New franchises such as Gears of War, Uncharted, and even Mass Effect were inspired by the fundamentals Resident Evil 4 presented. Meanwhile, in the coming years, it would continue to influence everything from Batman Arkham to Grand Theft Auto, Ratchet & Clank, and even Dead Space. Put simply, Resident Evil 4 is a critical point in the evolution of third-person video games. Resident Evil 5 faced a significant challenge in extending or innovating the core pillars both of Resident Evil 4 and the rest of the franchise as well. But if anything, it continues down the path Resident Evil 4 established and avoids taking any direction that would deviate from it. The game doubles down on the action focus, with a campaign that is highly linear, with a much stronger focus on encounter design and making the player feel the pressure of being overwhelmed by Magini, locals infected with an enhanced strain of Las Plagas. The real innovation of Resident Evil 5 being the introduction of Sheva Alomar, a companion to series mainstay Chris Redfield that can be controlled either by AI or a second player. Sheva reintroduces one aspect of the resource management pillar, in that, like Resident Evil 0 before it, players must manage available health, ammo, and resources by sharing them between one another. While resources are aplenty, you're now eating for two, so you have to figure out how to balance the item usage more effectively across both characters, or argue with a pal over which of you gets to use the shotgun. However, the introduction of a second hero character, and ultimately one that is playable, sets the tone for both this game and its successor Resident Evil 6 by completely stripping the remnants of horror from the equation. Much of the horror of classic Resident Evil titles, and even the revamp in RE4, was that the player faced off against a variety of monstrosities alone, and the 3Cs still put pressure on you in the heat of combat. RE4 had moved more in the direction of terror, with the dread punctuating an urgency for action, but it still had a handful of horror-laden moments, and more critically, it forced the player to face them alone, given Ashley is of no help in any circumstance, providing another axis from which your anxiety can grow. By introducing Sheva, a powerful ally who shares the same camera, character, and control as Chris, it lessens the more horrific aspects of the game, and this is something that Resident Evil 5 is well aware of, given the game shakes off the pretense of being a horror game and leaning more into the action mold as the campaign progresses. The encounters in Kujuju are much more intense than in previous games, and from the first major sequence in the opening chapter of Resident Evil 5, you feel that intensity. The fight at the public assembly is built much like the village in Resident Evil 4, with players fighting off waves of enemies until the fight is interrupted. But the game this time around feels even more intense given the cooperative nature of the game. With 2 targets to eliminate, there are often significantly more Magini in a given encounter than there were Ganados. Their agency is largely similar, but with small tweaks to enable them to be slightly more agile, such as interacting with new elements like fences, and are arguably less aggressive up close. I suspect in an attempt to balance the gameplay given so many of them can gang up on you at once. But ultimately the game leans more and more on the intensity of combat, working together to thin the crowd and focus on larger targets. This is all the more evident with a rather significant change that occurs midway through the campaign that speaks not just to the shift in priorities, but the conflict with its existing structure. In its latter hours, the game introduces Magini who carry firearms, and the game introduces cover mechanics that allow for the player to hide behind cover and pop out to take a shot, in a manner akin to Gears of War and Uncharted. It's an odd exchange, given the cover mechanics only exist in certain locations, plus the existing control scheme of Resident Evil 5 still doesn't allow for the player to move while aiming down sight, a common feature in many of the games it is now evoking. By the closing chapters of Resident Evil 5, we're fighting off swathes of armed soldiers, and regularly going into cover to find an opening. But the 3Cs of the player are still very much rooted in the horror aspects of Resident Evil 4, with the only notable change, outside of the teammate collaboration, is the ability to strafe left to right when the weapon is not aimed. It ultimately feels clunky and a touch awkward, because the core mechanics of the game no longer align with its design ambitions. That said, if you can forgive Resident Evil 5 for deviating further from the core formula, It's a really good cooperative shooter, given the amount of tactical agency each player has at their disposal. And this brings us to Resident Evil 6, released in 2012 and is for many the most controversial entry in the series. The closing chapter of this second trilogy embraces the focused lens of survival action seen in the closing chapters of Resident Evil 5. The series has pivoted entirely from the horror tropes to an action focus of geopolitical chaos and corporate espionage, all with its own ridiculous Capcom sheen. The pace of combat is increased even further and embraces the cooperative gameplay as a more intrinsic element, but all the while it tries to appease players who preferred the creepier campaign of Resident Evil 4. To do this, RE6 has not one, not two, but 4 different campaigns, all of which can be played in co-op. Each of these storylines takes place within the same period of time and frequently overlap with one another to give a sense of the larger narrative, but they aim to be distinct experiences while sharing the same core mechanics. Speaking of, it's worth exploring the 3 Cs of Resident Evil 6. The game is undoubtedly the fastest paced in the series. Character default movement speeds deviate drastically from the plodding walking speeds of RE4 and 5. Meanwhile, your sprint function is now full tilt, and much faster than anything seen to date. The over-the-shoulder shooting returns, but the player can now move around while aiming down sight, and the melee system has received an overhaul with a stamina meter designed to stop you kicking every zombie in sight to death, though quite often that is still a valid tactic. Plus, you can now jump to dodge enemies and fight them off while on the ground. Not to mention the range of interactions with the local environment has increased as well, jumping over tables, climbing up parts of the map, and a new cover system that is more thorough than Resident Evil 5, but is somehow even more difficult to use. This revision addresses the issues with Resident Evil 5 by acknowledging the action focus and revamping the mechanics to better align with it. That said, it's this revision that makes it so much clearer to the average player how far we've deviated from Resident Evil 4, which may well have influenced the game's critical reception. The resource management pillar reinforces the action pillar once again. Unlike pretty much every other game in the series, ammunition is plentiful. But this time around the sharing of resources with an AI buddy is removed. Hence from the very beginning, and despite the sheer number of enemies you face off against, it's difficult to run out of ammo at any time. Typically by the time you reach the 4th chapter of each campaign, you'll find yourself over-encumbered with ammunition and focusing less on the terror of Neo Umbrella and just whether you can somehow find room to pick up another couple rounds for your grenade launcher. But this is where the environment knowledge becomes even less relevant. Each campaign is typically even more linear than those seen in Resident Evil 5. The increased fidelity of all playable characters combined with the greater action focus means that the encounters themselves in each campaign do a lot of the heavy lifting and making the gameplay for each feel unique. Plus the enemy AI selected for each campaign highlights this further, while also exposing the limitations of the game's design. Leon Kennedy returns from Resident Evil 4 with a campaign with his new partner, Helena Harper, that is intent on being the more horror-focused story. It strives for a building of tension, with longer sequences of limited zombie interactions and a gradual increase of difficulty and pace. Meanwhile, Chris Redfield returns from Resident Evil 5 with fellow BSAA operative Piers Nivens with a campaign that is really a continuation of the action-focused trajectory of the previous game. The 3rd campaign, starring Shelley Birkin from Resident Evil 2 and Jake Muller, the illegitimate son of Albert Wesker, is almost as, if not even more action-focused than Chris's. The 4th and final campaign, starring the enigmatic mercenary Ada Wong, is unique in that it's designed to be single-player only, however Capcom later patched the multiplayer in. However, it's the campaign that most capably exposes the limitations of Resident Evil 6. Ada's campaign has a distinct focus on stealth, with several parts of the campaign built around stealthily removing guards and avoiding being spotted, even though the 3 Cs and the enemy AI doesn't really support it. What's fascinating to observe is how the market and even Capcom themselves recognise the deviation of Resident Evil from survival horror into the more intense action franchise it has become. Shinji Mikami, the director of Resident Evil 1, Dino Crisis and Resident Evil 4, not to mention a producer on most entries of the franchise up until 2005, left Capcom in 2007. And explored some other aspects of survival horror and intense action, first directing the ridiculous combat shooter Vanquish by Platinum Games in 2010, followed by a return to the slower-paced, more intense survival horror of Resident Evil in 2014's The Evil Within, a game with a much greater emphasis on the core pillars of Resident Evil than the more recent entries of the franchise. But even then, the Resident Evil series itself was questioning how far it had deviated from its roots, and how best to address it. In the same year as Resident Evil 6, we saw the release of Resident Evil Revelations exclusively for the Nintendo 3DS, with ports to PC, PlayStation and Xbox in 2013. Set after the events of Resident Evil 4 and starring series mainstay Jill Valentine, the game is a tighter, more claustrophobic experience that is much more akin to Resident Evil 4, but with its own accommodations to suit the hardware it was running on. Both the player and enemy AI move and act more slowly than they do in the main entries of the series, plus the return of sound as a mechanism to detect nearby enemies, a notion largely ignored in 5 and 6 given the intensity of combat. The three pillars return in force, with the majority of Revelations taking place on the Queen Zenobia cruise ship in much the same way as earlier games, plus a real emphasis on resource management. Meanwhile, the Revelations series continued in 2015 with a sequel that pulled on this notion of survival horror, while also relying on unused and beloved characters from the franchise, notably Claire Redfield and Barry Burton. However, it falls much more in line with Resident Evil 0, with players working on their own or with a friend to solve puzzles and avoid enemies in a largely linear gameplay experience. It's safe to say, looking back on this era of the franchise, audiences have a much stronger affinity for Resident Evil 4 than anything else. In fact, even the ports of Resident Evil 4 to other platforms, notably the version on the Nintendo Wii, are still held in high regard. More recently, the release of a new port of the game to the Oculus Quest 2 in late 2021 has reinforced that sense of enthusiasm and wonder. The Oculus version of the game is no meagre port, but rather a complete rebuild of the game in Unreal Engine, and what's so interesting about it is how well the game pivots to the largely first-person perspective as those core design elements ring true. The emphasis on reflexes and precision in the gunplay are readily reinforced by this VR port. Handling the weapon feels great and continues to be an intense experience, but so many of the other design elements around the 3Cs are retained by changing the game in very subtle ways. While the character remains largely untouched, both the camera and controls are much more nuanced. Given that we now see everything through Leon's eyes, it reinforces the existing dread and anxiety that players can feel when caught in the thick of it. Before, given we were looking over Leon's shoulder, we couldn't really tell what was behind him. Now you're acting in Leon's place. Instead of a Ganado being behind Leon, they're behind you. Plus the gunplay is much faster and more responsive. It's reworked to include a more engaging reload mechanic that forces the player to grab ammo and load it into the gun, or pull the pin on grenades before throwing it themselves. Plus you can now move around while shooting your weapon. This increased complexity in the gunplay makes it all the more engaging, and helps Resident Evil 4 retain its undeniable tension while also feeling incredibly modern. In amongst all of this, there's something to be said for the enemy encounters. These are largely left untouched, and are still as much fun as they were before. However, given the increased combat fidelity, most enemies move faster, attack more frequently, and dodge and weave more often. What makes this port so special is that it plays like you remember Resident Evil 4. As stated already, it's undeniable that Resident Evil 4 established a standard, and it's arguably a combination of the hokey narrative, well-crafted fight sequences, and a more consistent gameplay experience that has led to it being hailed as a modern classic, while the latter entries received less adoration. There's an argument to be made that the love for RE4 is reinforced by the direction taken in 5 and 6. The series continues to break away from the survival horror template of earlier games, becoming much more action-focused. The leaning towards terror stripping the more horrific aspects of the series, the sense of fear begins to dissipate as the narrative and mechanical framing makes it clear these are simply adversaries to overcome. If presented with a stack of enemies, do I need to defeat them all? And will my failure to do so punish me at a later time? 4 through 6 slowly strip these questions of potency. The more action-focused the series becomes, the less these questions linger. Thanks for watching part 2 of Revisiting Evil here on Design Dive. This series started out because I spent a lot of early 2021 replaying Resident Evil 4 and 5, followed by the Revelations games and my first playthrough of Resident Evil 6, so putting these thoughts down to share with you has been in the making for a little while now. In part 3 we will return to discuss the remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3, two games that adapt the Resident Evil 4 formula but satisfy and retain the survival horror of earlier established titles. But until then, like the video, subscribe, share it around, or be like these awesome people who support me on Patreon, like David Thomas and Frank Rooney and Happy Pie, who have all joined up recently and helped support me to make videos and still have money to allow me to make a sandwich when I'm finished. And also, pay my bills, be able to sleep under a roof and all that sort of jazz. These things are really handy, so, supporting this right here helps a lot.